Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. Our guest in this podcast is Manhattan Institute Fellow and City Journal contributing editor Heather McDonald. It was recorded from a recent webinar with PRI's own Steve Hayward during the Q&A. Heather offers her perspective on the recent riots, the surge in violent crime in our cities, and calls for defunding police departments. Thanks for joining us.
I'm going to give you a little secret for public speaking. It's assumed for speakers that we're supposed to be optimistic. It's kind of a received wisdom that audiences want to believe that we are winning and come away with a good feeling. I'm afraid I'm going to violate that protocol, and I'm going to speak from the heart without any sugarcoating. I think that the situation that we're in right now with regards to law and order in this country is unspeakably bad. It should be the only thing we're talking about as far as I'm concerned. I am amazed at the lack of attention that is paid not only on the part of the mainstream media, which is completely believable and expectable, but it seems like most people are not even aware now of the anarchy that is going on an almost daily basis in cities across the country, and the profound attack on the most basic institutions of legitimacy in this country, which is the institutions of the criminal justice system. And to a certain extent, if people are not watching Fox News or reading alternative media, they literally do not know what's going on because the New York Times and the Washington Post will not cover the riots. The assassination attempt that we had over the weekend in Compton, California, against two sheriff's deputies who were sitting in a parked car. A man ran up to the car and shot both of them point blank in the face. That's just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see more of those. To be perfectly honest, and I'm reluctant to jinx things, I think we may even get assassination attempts on the president. But that recent incident, which again should be a wake-up call to us that we are playing with fire with this narrative about police racism, that's only the most egregious case. There have been hot riots, but there are cold riots going on every single day. When officers get out of their cars today to make a pedestrian stop, to question a suspect, to try and arrest somebody who's just engaged in a drive-by shooting, they routinely find themselves now attacked, assaulted, surrounded by hostile jeering crowds. In Chicago, people have tried to pull gun suspects from officers' patrol cars. In Baltimore, an officer was shot in the stomach trying to break up an illegal house party. These are not only incidents when you've got riot control and officers are being pelted with glass bottles and jugs and nails and metal projectiles. It's also just going about their ordinary duties. Any attack on a police officer is an attack on us all, and it is an attack on civilization itself. They are the embodiment of the rule of law. Fatal police shootings are up this year, and I predict they will continue to be up. Now, the riots that we've seen at a really alarming rate this summer were justified by much of the mainstream media, by a lot of Democratic politicians, by a lot of opinion writers, as a righteous response to police injustice and police racism. You've probably all come across the various op-eds saying that, well, what's the big deal with looting? The owners have insurance. This is a form of reparations. These people are starving because of COVID. They're just that forces them to take a stolen pickup truck and bash into Gucci on the Magnificent Mile in Chicago. believe me, if you could have an emoji, I'd have a sarcasm emoji at this point, because it is an absurd justification. These riots have been opportunistic. Nobody is going hungry in this country. They are not stealing Rolex watches because they don't have bread. They're doing this because the message has been sent repeatedly that we expect this, that it's normal, and that there will be minor response, if any. And the absurd narrative is that the riots are all the fault of Trump, when, as again, if you've been paying attention, we know the causality is precisely reversed. The riots began, say, in Portland, and then Trump sent in or tried to send in some federal troops to protect federal property, which he was perfectly authorized under the law to do. It wasn't as if Trump came in first to protect federal property against riots, and then the riots happened. It's just the opposite. And nevertheless, that is the dominant narrative in the Democratic National Convention and ongoing, that the riots are Trump's fault for heavy-handed policing. This weekend, we saw more riots in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where my aunt used to live, Amish country, and yet they've got their ready-to-go Antifa and Black Lives Matter thugs there as well, that are setting a new message to police officers that is going to result in even further resignations, departures from the force, and backing off of proactive policing. A police officer was answering a domestic violence call. A man came running out of the house, the same man who had been arrested and was awaiting trial for slashing 4 people last year. He came running out of the house and went running at an officer, brandishing a long knife above his head. The officer, by all appearances, was authorized to use fatal force to protect himself from a quite clear lethal threat, and he opened fire and killed the man. This produced riots over the weekend in Lancaster, the usual projectiles hurled at officers, the usual torching of the police precinct, the dumpsters, fires being set, post office being vandalized, stores being vandalized. The message is that officers are not even allowed to defend themselves from lethal force. They're supposed to just accept being shot or slashed in penance for their own racism. So the elite justifications for the riots have sent to potential criminals a very clear message that we have lost the will to enforce basic criminal laws. And what we're seeing across the country is what I've called Ferguson Effect 2.0, or the Minneapolis effect. I wrote about the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement in the war on cops. This broke out in 2015 and 2016 under the similar Black Lives Matter narrative that policing is systemically biased. The cops backed off of proactive policing, the type of discretionary policing that is so essential to getting guns off the street and deterring crime. Another 2,000 Black lives were taken in 2015 and 2016 thanks to officers backing off under the phony narrative of police racism. What we're seeing today, what we have seen in this summer, since late May when George Floyd died under the knee of Derek Chauvin, puts the first Ferguson effect. It makes it look like child's play. The escalation of crime that we're seeing across the country is unprecedented. You're seeing shootings and homicides go up in cities across the country at 200% rate. The incidents of crime are of unbelievable stupidity, savagery, banality. Over 36 Black children have been killed since the George Floyd shooting. Nobody pays attention. None of them have been shot by a cop. None have been shot by a white person. They've all been shot by Black criminals. They've been shot in their backyards. They've been shot in their bedrooms. They've been shot in their front yards. They've been shot back at barbecues. People are being shot at funeral services for other gangbangers who were shot. The chain reactions are breaking out. It's absolute carnage, to use one of Donald Trump's absolutely justified and much maligned terms. There's no other way to describe it. And yet, all we're talking about right now, in the face of these insane drive-by shootings, are police racism and white supremacy. I'm going to address both of those. We've had this narrative about police racism for years. You may remember its first iteration in the 1990s, Driving While Black. And it is a simple received truth within academia, within the media, within any sort of elite establishment, that the criminal justice system in general and policing in particular is shot through with systemic bias. Nobody ever explains how that happens, but we're just supposed to accept that as a description. I'm going to give you, if there's one thing you should take away from today's talk, it's this. The way they get away with that charge is by using the wrong benchmark. Benchmark is everything in this debate. Here's how the narrative about police racism and criminal justice system racism is generated. The activists and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the ACLU get their hands on any given category of police activity, whether it's arrests, whether it's prosecutions in the case of the system generally, whether it's police pedestrian stops, the known as stop, question, and frisk, whether it's police shootings. And they compare those rates of police activity to population ratios. And if there's a disparity, they conclude that the police are racist. Let me flesh this out. That's abstract. Let me give you a concrete example that is exactly what we're talking about today. Every year for the past 5 years since this data has been kept, the police have shot fatally about 1,000 people. We can talk later about whether that's too high or possibly too low, given what violent crime is uniquely in this country and what the number of civilian police encounters are each year. But 1,000 fatal police shootings, the vast majority of those victims, up to 90%, are armed, dangerous, and threatening the officer and resisting arrest. 50%, around 50% each year, are white victims of fatal police shootings. You never hear about them. And about 25% of those 1,000 are Black victims of fatal police shootings. So the media compares that 25% to Black population ratios in the population at large. Blacks are about 13% of the nation's population. So they are shot at a rate of about 2 times, sometimes we see 2.5 times the rate of their representation in the population. For the left, that is prima facie evidence of police racism. You don't need to look any further. Population is the wrong benchmark. Policing today is data-driven. Police go where people are being victimized. That is disproportionately in minority neighborhoods. They are called to those minority neighborhoods on behalf of minority victims, and they are being given descriptions, if anybody for once is cooperating with the police, of minority suspects. Blacks in this country, and this is a thing that is difficult to talk about, because far from being white supremacist, whites are so goodwill that they turn their eyes away from the cultural breakdown that is leading to these crime rates. Blacks commit crime, violent street crime in this country at exponentially higher rates than whites or Asians, and higher rates than Hispanics. Though Blacks are 13% of the population, they commit about 60% nationally, of homicides and robberies in the 75 largest counties. The homicide ratio between whites and blacks is blacks commit homicide at about 12-to-1 rate compared to whites. In any given city, let's look at Chicago, blacks and whites are each a little under a third of the population. Blacks commit about 80% of all shootings and homicides, whites less than 1%. Those disparities exist in every single city. I don't care if it's New York City, I don't care if it's St. Louis, I don't care if it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, every single city. The sad fact of the matter is, and again, I'm speaking bluntly, we're among friends, we're adults. I think we can take the truth. The face of violent street crime today in America, and I'm talking about those drive-by shootings and street robberies, is overwhelmingly Black and Hispanic. So the 25% police fatal shooting rate, when measured against crime rates, is not just not disproportionate in showing police racism. When you take homicide rates into account, that 2-to-1 or 2.5-to-1 disparity flips completely, in the words of a criminologist who I cited recently and caused him to retract his study because I was citing it verbatim, and he was giving data to show that there is not systemic police racism, but he was so upset that that got into the public discourse that he retracted the study. Anyway, as Joseph Cesario has said, Michigan State University criminologist, when you take violent crime rates into account, the police shooting disparities flip completely. It turns out that whites are more likely to be fatally shot by the police than their crime rates would predict, or than blacks. So let me give you just, it's the afternoon. We don't want to get bogged down in numbers. I'm just going to throw out a few others. So that's the vast bulk of police shootings. Again, the narrative that we're living through an epidemic of racist police shootings is simply false. It is wrong. There is nothing to it. Last year, the police shot 9 allegedly unarmed Black victims fatally. I say allegedly because this category comes from the Washington Post, which has been keeping a database of fatal police shootings for the last 5 years. The Washington Post defines unarmed extremely generously. So if you're grabbing an officer's gun and beating him with it, you count as unarmed. Or if you're escaping from a car stop in a stolen car with a handgun in the seat next to you, you're unarmed if you get shot. So 9 unarmed victims of police shootings last year, 19 unarmed white victims. Those 9 unarmed white victims, and again, remember, we're hearing this narrative from Joe Biden, echoing President Obama, that blacks cannot go out of their house without fearing that their children will be shot, that they will be shot by the police. Completely wrong. There were about 7,300 Black victims of homicide in 2019. They were shot overwhelmingly, again, by other Blacks, not by the cops, not by whites, but other Blacks. Those 9 allegedly unarmed victims of fatal police shootings represent 0.1% of all Blacks who died of homicide. So again, phony narrative. And I will give you one. We can argue data, you can argue numbers, we can also argue anecdotes. This summer of arson, this summer of violence, this summer of hatred, this summer of cop assassinations was set off by the death of George Floyd. Everybody thinks that George Floyd is representative of how Blacks die at the hands of the police. Nobody has heard of Tony Timpa. Tony Timpa was a complete adumbration of the Floyd incident. Timpa, in 2016 in Dallas, called 911 He said, I'm schizophrenic, I'm off my meds, I need help, I'm scared. The police came, responded. He'd already been handcuffed by store security guards. The police put him on his stomach. He was handcuffed behind him on the ground and kept their knee on his back for 13 minutes. George Floyd is 9 minutes, during which time Timpa said 30 times, "You're killing me." The officers joked about his mental condition. And when the ambulance came and they loaded him onto the ambulance, he'd stopped moving and talking by then. One of the officers said, "I hope we hadn't killed him." Well, he had, at that point, he was dead. He died from the pressure and also from a drug overdose. Nobody's heard of Tony Timpa. Why? Because he was white. If Timpa had been black, we would have had the Timpa riots. There are instances of unarmed whites being killed by the police that would become international cause célèbre had the victims been black. What you think you know about policing is exclusively the result of selective coverage. Now, I'm just going to end here very quickly. Because of this phony narrative of criminal justice racism, if you want to know, even without the riots, why cities are becoming hellholes of anarchy, disorder, chaos, it's because of the fact that given black crime rates, there is not a single criminal justice practice which does not have a disparate impact on blacks. For those lawyers among us, you probably already know that disparate impact is one of the most pernicious legal concepts out there. There is no colorblind enforcement of any criminal law that will not disproportionately affect blacks because their crime rates are so much higher. And so instead of addressing the underlying problem, we do not have a policing problem in this country, we have a crime problem. We turn our eyes away, we blame the messenger, and we are unraveling our entire gamut of criminal justice practices. Broken windows policing, public order enforcement, misdemeanor enforcement against turnstile jumping, urinating in public, homelessness, all the stuff that is making San Francisco so uninhabitable. Left-wing district attorneys are saying we are not going to enforce those laws because they have a disparate impact on blacks. Therefore, those laws must be racist. That is why this anarchy is happening. Cities are falling apart. They will continue falling apart unless we have the courage to take on the myth of what I call the myth of bias, which says that any racial disparity in our world is by definition the result of white bias as opposed to behavioral choices, different cultural choices. I said I would talk about white supremacy. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to turn it over to Steve in questions. I would just say that is another myth. The idea that white supremacy defines our world, let me just say, please do not accept that. There is not a single mainstream institution in this country that is not turning itself into knots to hire and promote as many minorities, underrepresented minorities, blacks and Hispanics as possible, whether it's a university, whether it's a bank, whether it's a Silicon Valley tech firm, whether it's a law firm, whether it's an accounting firm, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a foundation, whether it's an arts organization, museum, classical. If you want to get your kid to get into Harvard, I suggest you check the black box for him. That's going to give him a huge advantage. Do not accept the lie that this is a white supremacist country. And so I will leave it at there, and thank you for your attention.
I want to do just a couple follow-up questions before we turn to the listeners. And one thing I want to do is step back and take a long view and ask the question, how did we get here? And by that I mean, let's just take two markers here from recent history. One is last Friday, the country observed the 19th anniversary of 9/11. around which time everyone remembers that the police were the heroes of New York.
Yes.
And collaterally, the police everywhere. They became this new class of people of, we call them first responders, which means, fire and safety, but also the police, right? And a few years before that, I'm old enough to remember when President Clinton and, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, a guy named Joe Biden, were boasting how they were going to put 100,000 more police on the street. And not only are we going to put 100,000 more police on the street, but we're going to crack down on super predators, and we're going to get tough on crime, and we're going to encourage community policing. And in other words, policing that works. And so at this point, if you were Rip Van Winkle and you woke up 25 years later to see the current scene, the question you'd ask, how did we go from police being the heroes and being tough on crime was something that the public wanted, to defund the police and worse, right? You and I know, and the popular graffiti now is ACAB. All cops are bastards, right? Not just a couple bad, all cops. And you hear things like one I saw yesterday, someone saying, what about all these black police chiefs? And someone said, well, if you join the police, you're no longer black. I mean, it's that crazy. So how did you were way ahead of the curve with the war on cops in 2016. And I'm kind of thinking you need to do a second volume or an updated edition, but what changed? How did this happen? How did we get here?
Well, for one thing, 9/11 was a little bitter for officers because before that, there had already been a fairly acute anti-cop narrative, and it was a whiplash for them to all of a sudden go from being the racial profilers, because again, the racial profiling, driving while black narrative was well underway by the late 1990s. And so there were reports going out, lawsuits going on, consent decrees being slapped on state police in New Jersey and elsewhere for allegedly singling out black drivers for stops. We can go into that data. That is also phony. Blacks speed more, twice the rate of whites. So, again, benchmark matters. So that was really a temporary interregnum that we went back to the status quo ante pretty soon. And it was a bitter moment in a sense for officers. Going back to the 94 crime bill with Biden and Clinton, in a sense, it's because policing worked. New York City started a policing revolution that spread across the country in 1994 under Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and William Bratton, which was the data-driven policing that I mentioned before. Relentless attention to crime data on a minute-by-minute basis. In the early 90s, I remember a Stanford historian, Lawrence Friedman, had written a book saying, well, basically, violent crime is just the fate of America's cities. There's nothing we can do about it. We're a violent country. Get over it. Get used to it. Nobody saw the crime drop coming. And it was exclusively the result both of better, accountable, fanatically attentive policing and the higher incarceration rates, the mandatory minimums, the certainty in sentencing that kicked in the 1990s and started finally putting people off the streets, hardened criminals for good. And so crime went down. People forgot about what it was like in the bad old days of the early 1990s and the early 1980s. New York City, as in Giuliani's second term, the New York Times was just gritting its teeth in fury that he had not only taken on crime, he'd also taken on the welfare industrial complex, said everybody's got to have some personal responsibility if you're going to be on welfare. And so they made a big deal of the 1999 shooting of Amadou Diallo, a West Ghanaian immigrant shot 41 times. We had Al Sharpton leading daily protests, Susan Sarandon and other celebrities getting shot getting arrested rather at the police headquarters. So it was happening. And I wrote, my first book, Are Cops Racist, was in a response to the 1990s narrative about policing. I think it's gotten worse for sure, Steve. And for that, I explain that by we've had another 2 decades of college graduates coming out and entering the world at large who have been absolutely brainwashed from the moment they step on campus to believe that America is systemically racist.
Yeah, I was having my long list of possible things to bring up with you, the sort of broader general institutional crisis. Let me save that for the moment. And let me try a sort of a second Rip Van Winkle question. And that's to put it this way. You mentioned early on that, you don't want to be Pollyannish or give false optimism about how bad things are and how things may get worse. I think I agree with all that. On the other hand, if you hop into a time machine and you go back to, say, 1968, 1969, when things look pretty grim, and so the question I guess I'm coming to is, if you'd asked somebody then two predictions. One, if you'd asked somebody then, because a lot of things, same things are being said then and are said now. The country's coming apart, things are getting worse and worse. Nobody knows what to do about it. We probably can't fix it. And by the way, if you had predicted even as late as 1989 that not only would the crime rate fall dramatically, but that New York City would lead the way, they would have sent for the men in the white coats to put their knee on your neck, right? So the question is experience is a tough teacher. It took a while for the ruin of the 60s and then carrying well into the 70s to finally generate a critical mass of opinion, political sentiment, and leadership to say, no, actually, we can fix things. And I guess I'm wondering, I've never been one for the cycles of history theories, the rigid ones that go back to the classics, but I'm wondering if maybe that isn't what we're going through right now, that in fact, we're just going to have to learn our lessons again, especially the big cities, before we get around to fixing them. That's a slim read for optimism, but I wonder what you think.
No, I think that's always a question, was it worse, say, the campus riots in the 60s than today, and Weather Underground? And, there were groups that were explicitly dedicated to destruction. Now that I think Black Lives Matter would say, oh, no, it's just happenstance. First of all, I agree with you. I don't agree with the cycles of history. I think we are dependent on, to a certain extent, the serendipity of great leaders coming forward. Who could have foreseen Rudolph Giuliani? That was a man who understood the fundamentals of civil society in a way that is insufficiently appreciated. And unfortunately, I think he kind of has underplayed his own successes. He wanted to be the 9/11 candidate. He should have been the civil order candidate. But in any case, if we get more people like that are able to articulate the necessity of law and order, perhaps we could turn this around. I would say, though, that a big difference, Steve, is that in the 60s and 70s, you did not have the entire elite establishment justifying that violence. What we saw this summer, which I wrote about for City Journal, with every single corporation, every single college president issuing these absurd self-apologies, self-incrimination, but more importantly, incriminating American society itself, and saying that we need to completely change meritocratic standards. There's not going to be meritocracy anymore. You cannot assume that any female or Black or Hispanic who's in a position of power is there because of merit, as opposed to filling a quota. And I can just say that that's true for females, and it's definitely true for minorities as well. This too, I think, is the product of the academy. But we have now a stated tolerance for riots in a way that I don't think. Now, I was younger in the 60s riots, so I wasn't politically aware at that point, but I don't think that the media was involved in the same kind of exculpatory behavior. I think there's white self-hatred and white guilt has reached by now a truly pathological level. It is a psychosis that I've never seen anything like.
Yeah. Although, I think you're right. It's you can find some fragments of this back in the 60s. If you've never read it, the stupid Kerner Commission report in 1968, it was really dumb. And now it's that on steroids, right? Okay. Let me ask you a couple of questions about broader questions about law enforcement. A couple of these come from our readers. One is all human organizations have a few bad apples, is the cliche, and so. Okay, so some police, for whatever reasons, maybe they have alcohol problems, maybe they have anger management issues at home, who knows? And so how should they be dealt with? And one question comes up a lot is, are police unions a part, not the part, but a part of the problem? And what does Heather McDonald think, what reforms does Heather McDonald think might be sensible and worth pursuing in a more sane world?
Well, first of all, I'm not willing to concede that there is a problem. I just do not concede that there is a systemic problem of police unprofessionalism or racism. The policing today is more professional than it's ever been, and that's not just a relative standard. I would say it is in a qualitative sense professional. And whether there's some podunk, pot-bellied sheriff down in the South, and again, this is I'm engaging in stereotyping here. I don't know, but I have had, as far as unions go, there are police chiefs whom I respect that say, yes, some unions do make it too difficult to remove bad officers. Police unions vary. There's some that are quite powerful. There's others that are less powerful. It's not uniform across the profession. So on the other hand, and this is not something that I have studied per se, so I'm really just giving you my gut reaction and what I've heard. From the police officer's perspective, let's just flip the tables for a moment. This is what they feel. They really are hunkered down, and this can be, police officers can be a pain in the butt. They are whiners. If you read Second City Cop in Chicago or anything else, there's like never a commissioner they've ever liked, but they feel that the world does not understand them, and to a large extent, they are correct, and they have an us against them mentality for sure. So they have things like a 72-hour rule where if there's been a police shooting, in many places they don't have to talk to investigators for 72 hours. The idea there is they want to get their thoughts together. It's extremely agitating, adrenaline going. If you've been in a shooting, no cop wants to be in that. That sort of rule is viewed as too police protective. But part of me thinks, there's a reason why they feel like they need these strong police protections, because they are terrified that these left-wing prosecutors that we're seeing more and more of now are going to bring utterly ungrounded charges, as in the George Floyd case or the Atlanta case, Rayshard Brooks, again, way overcharged. And so they see things as quite adversarial. So I would, there's things, certainly police cameras are a good thing. The problem there, and most departments want them, is the cost of storing the tape. It's something that nobody's figured out how to solve yet. I'm all for more training, more tactical training, but everybody wants kind of a silver bullet. And if we get rid of police unions or emasculate them, things are going to be okay. It's really, and the other thing I would say, the first thing you always hear in the media, if there's been a shooting, they'll go and say, oh, this officer has X number of civilian complaints against him. And that, again, is perceived as prima facie evidence that this is a bad cop. Not necessarily. Active cops get civilian complaints. Most cops are lazy. Most cops drive on by, they wait for the next 911 call to come over the radio. They don't get out of their cop car at 2 a.m. and ask questions of that guy hanging out on a known drug corner. A small percentage of those guys are doing that hard work. Those that do, the drug dealers routinely file civilian complaints against them in retaliation. So that little piece of received wisdom there's these cops that have long histories of civilian complaints, it does not necessarily, it may mean that that's a bad officer who should have been removed from the force, but it may not necessarily mean that.
Yeah, so I have complicated views on this that I have not done a lot of work on directly, but it strikes me that one reason for the reluctance to open that can of worms is that if once you say we need to diminish the power of police unions, well, for protecting potentially bad cops, shouldn't you also say that about teachers' unions,
Right.
which is something I know we can
Right.
go on a long time about.
Right.
I will mention, just as a point of personal privilege, I guess you might say, about a week ago, I finished a month-long trial on a jury, a criminal case, where it emerged this very strange defendant had filed a complaint against the local sheriff's department for every single visit to his house, which were frequent. It was an intimidation tactic on his part, turned out. And that's a longer story for some other time. A related question that several people have brought up is, and you made brief reference to it here, is it used to be district attorneys were the tough on crime people. You brought them a case, they wanted to charge it. They wanted to convict people or at least get a strong plea deal with somebody. Today, we're now we're electing anti-law and order district attorneys, the most flamboyant being Chesapeake Dean in San Francisco, but they seem to be spreading lots of places, lots of unlikely places. And I don't know if how closely you're following all that, but that looks to me like a very large part of the problem now.
It is. It is and it's going to be an even larger part of the problem moving forward, because again, they are not bringing low-level prosecutions, all because of disparate impact. That disparate impact is the concept that is driving the features of our world today. We are unwinding the criminal justice system because you cannot enforce criminal justice laws without having a disparate impact on blacks. So we have two options. We can either stop enforcing the law, or we can say it is not the fault of the laws. We need to not turn our eyes away from the cultural breakdown that is producing this high level of crime. And that's why I say again that the largest issue of all is the myth of bias. As long as the elites accept the idea that our world, the shape of our world, any racial disparities are the product of bias, not behavior, the left wins. The left wins. We have to take on that claim.
Yeah, so, I was going to come back to the cultural breakdown question. You mentioned just now and in your opening talk about the much higher crime rate among blacks, and it wasn't always true, was it? I'm not sure how far back we have good statistics, but my understanding from just little fragments here and there is that back in say the 40s and 50s, the crime rates among black populations were not that much elevated among everywhere else, or am I wrong about that, or do you know? You can see where I'm going with all this. And a lot of this really is the consequence of the modern post-60s welfare state.
Partly, but it's always been higher. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois did a ethnography of Philadelphia, and he was complaining about the crime rates, the prostitution, the vice law violations and things like that. Barry Latzer wrote a book about that. There's always been disparities. Now, I think black crime really did explode in the 60s for a variety of reasons. And let us also just dispose quickly of the idea that crime is driven by economic need. The 60s, very strong economy, black crime exploded. The lowest crime period in the US history was during the Depression. The 2008 recession, crime stayed low. So do not, again, viewers, listeners, do not accept that as an explanation. So yes, cultural breakdown, family breakdown. We all know the President Moynihan report that said when black family out of wedlock birth rate was 23%, that spelled the end to any further civil rights progress, because having all of these uncivilized young black males walking around was going to result in white flight. He was absolutely right. 23%, Moynihan said this is a catastrophe. It's now about 70%. So if that was a catastrophe, we're in like Armageddon right now, which is in fact what's going on.
Yeah. Now, you made note about the fact that all of our elite institutions have lined up behind all the nonsense and misinformation. And it looks like it's taking quite a toll. Being a political scientist, for my sins, I read a lot of survey data, and the Gallup survey on institutional trust shows that after the Ferguson, Missouri events of 2015, public esteem for the police actually went up a bit. And however, after Minneapolis here 3-4 months ago, it's now gone down to the lowest point in the 26 years that Gallup has been asking about policing. The public in general says, for the first time, below 50% of public esteem for the police, whereas it used to be at 58, 60%. At the same time, another survey of Gallup of minorities shows that Blacks and Hispanics prefer the same level of policing or more by over 80%. And this gets back to a point you've been making for years, which is the primary victims of these enthusiasms, that's too generous a word for it, are in fact the very people that it's intended to help. In other words, the primary victims are Blacks and other low income and minority neighborhoods. So that brings me to a question a listener asks, and I'm going to restate it this way. For ordinary citizens who look at this array of a completely complacent media, our universities are nuts, our CEOs of corporations have lost their minds, and the police are demoralized, what should citizens do? Should they, they show up for Back the Blue rallies? Should they vote in certain obvious ways? Or what does Heather Mac Donald want to say to people who want to do something or say something or help?
Yes, it's tough. Obviously, voting. I mean, they haven't censored that yet. They haven't figured out a way to do that, but it's coming. And like Washington D.C.'s over, the mall is over. It's all going to come down. Civilization is being unwound now at just an unbelievable rate. Yes, if you are willing to go to a Back the Blue rally, that's fantastic. The media, only looks at left-wing protests. I would say, and I don't know how to get there logically, but I just have to repeat myself now for maybe the 20th time. As long as the myth of bias remains the dominant narrative, they win. Because the degree of white guilt at this point is so great that if you can blame whites for the fact that, yes, 30% of prisoners in this country are Black, even though Blacks are 13% of the population. If that's the fault of whites, not the fault of Black crime, whites are so guilty at this point that they will continue unwinding the edifice of civilization in penance. So if any listener has any outlet to start telling the truth about the behavioral disparities that result in these disparate outcomes of whether it's incarceration rates, whether it's poverty rates, whether it's household income due to low savings rates, high consumption rates, we have to start pushing back against this because I don't see a way out of this at this point. But that's the most difficult thing to do. But as long as that narrative holds, we lose our civilization.
Yeah. So we've come to the end of our hour, and so rather than end on that cheery note, let me just have you say briefly, where can people find the Heather Mac Donald archive? Should they look at Manhattan Institute or City Journal or both? Or
well, thank you. The Manhattan Institute now runs a Twitter feed for me, which is it's not like clever sayings. It's just if ever I publish anything or if there's a video or something to post, it's out there. So that's kind of current stuff. I don't know how far back that goes, but certainly the books, War on Cops or Diversity Delusion. And yeah, I guess you can, both City Journal and Manhattan Institute have some kind of archive, and I don't know how they differ. One has just City Journal articles, one has other articles. But anyway, I would obviously do not assume anybody taking the time to read me when they should be reading Steve Hayward and Powerline. But if you have extra moments after that far more compelling piece of journalistic cleverness and wit and humor, by all means, I would be honored to have readers. Thank you.
Thanks to Heather Mac Donald and Steve Hayward. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.